Good morning and welcome to our first event of Torah from Israel. I am Kobi Cohen, Bnei Jeshurun's Israel educator. Before we start, I would like to ask that you will turn off any app notifications you may have in the background. We will have plenty of time for questions, but we ask that you will put them in the chat box. And now, a few words from our Rabbi Roli Matalon.
Shavua Tov to everyone. Shavua Tov. I hope everybody is feeling good and not too alarmed by what's going on here in New York City and around the country and around the world. I hope everybody is holding on to healthy life. So just a few words of introduction. I have the great pleasure to introduce Yehudah Mirsky, who is a great combination of a really wonderful scholar and teacher and a gem of a human being. And that combination is not to be taken for granted. A true lover of God, the Jewish people, and humanity. And a few years ago, Yehudah published this book on which he had been working for many, many years, the biography of Rav Kook, Mystic in a Time of Revolution. He'd worked on this for a very long time and came out with this book, which is extraordinary. I've read it twice, not once, twice. It's beautiful, it's inspiring. It brings out Rav Kook's deep spirituality, his incredible vision, and his capacity to hold so many contradictions and complexities and to navigate through them as a leader that made a huge mark on our people and whose life and writings continue to inspire. So that's what Yehudah is going to unfold for us this morning. I highly recommend the book, even before he speaks. It's beautifully written, and it has incredible depth. It's a small book, so it's not one of those biographies that you can't get through. It's very readable and very beautifully done. So, by the way, well, I'll introduce him and then I'll say a few words, something else. Yehudah Mirsky is professor of Near Eastern and Judaic Studies at Brandeis, and he's on the faculty of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies. He studied at Yeshivat Har Zion and Yeshiva College and received rabbinic ordination in Jerusalem. He's a graduate of Yale Law School and completed his PhD in religion at Harvard. He worked in Washington as an aide to then Senators Bob Kerrey and Al Gore, and at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and he served in the Clinton administration as a special advisor in the U.S. State Department's Human Rights Bureau. He lives in Jerusalem, where he has been a grassroots activist. He has written widely on politics, theology, and culture for a number of publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, the New Republic, and The Economist, the Daily Beast, The Guardian, and others. After the attacks of September 11, he served as a volunteer chaplain for the Red Cross. He's the author of this beautiful volume, Rav Kook, Mystic in a Time of Revolution, published in 2014 by Yale University Press, recently published in Hebrew as Rav Kook, Mabat Hadash, a new look on Rav Kook by Devir, and most recently he published Toward the Mystical Experience of Modernity. I just want to add that he is married to Tamar Biala, another extraordinary scholar who is been writing for many years and publishing midrashim about women, by women, and it's a little bit of a revolution in the Jewish world, and we will be very pleased to host her sometime this winter and spring in her own right, but now we'll let Yehudah talk about his book.
So, Rav Roli, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to see you, even if at the remove of a computer. I appreciate your saying these kind words about, lover of God, Israel, humanity. You ought to know, because there are a few who match you in that regard. And thank you for mentioning my wife, Tamar Biala. I often say, I think you would appreciate when I say this, people like me teach about Jewish culture and Jewish spirit, living Jewish spirituality, and my wife is. So I'm glad, and her friendship with you is something we all cherish. And I also have to say thank you to Kobe, and thank you to everyone for bringing me and Kobe together, because it's just been so wonderful to get to know him and to talk with him in anticipation of today. So, as I understand it, this is one of the first of a series of meetings around the idea of Shemitah, right? The Shemitah, the sabbatical year, and its meanings in modern Jewish history and for our day. And so what I thought I would do, I prepared a little PowerPoint. You'll see I'm not very expert at putting these things together, but I have a PowerPoint and also a few photos. What I'd like to do is lay out, I'm sure this is from very familiar territory for some or most of you, or all of you even, but just to walk through some of the basics of what is this thing Shemitah, according to rabbinic law. What happened when the idea of Shemitah met the renewed Jewish settlement in the land of Israel in late 19th and early 20th centuries? And what were the rabbinic responses to a very challenging new reality, as Shemitah was something which brought together questions of Jewish tradition and practice and law, halacha, as well as questions of how one responds to a very dynamic, indeed revolutionary social situation. And in particular, we'll focus on the work of Rav Kook, who was, as always, monumental in his own right, and more about him in a moment, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, and who's also, as they say, good to think with. One of the reasons that I've enjoyed working on Rav Kook so many years is because he's sort of a one-man band, and if he's the kind of figure to engage him in scholarship means you have to study Jewish law and philosophy and theology and Kabbalah and history and sociology and comparative religion and the history of vegetarianism and God knows what. So I hope you'll find some of that of interest today. Now, at this point, I'd like to, can I share screen, Kobe? Okay, great. So at this point, I would like to, right, here we are. So, right, Rav Kook and the Shabbat of the land. Again, these are things that you presumably all know, but nonetheless. The basic outline of Shemitah.
You are muted.
Sorry. Okay, am I unmuted? Great. So in Hebrew, the verb shamot literally means to release or to let go of something, to let it go. So according to biblical law, every seventh year there is Shabbat Haaretz, right? The Sabbath of the land. I'll just briefly walk us through some of the biblical verses here, thanks to the good people of Sepharia, right? And here is Leviticus chapter 25, right? Vayikra Chafhei, and God, the Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land that I assign you, the land shall observe a Sabbath of the Lord, right? This commandment applies in the land of Israel. 6 years you may sow your field, and 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather in your field. But in the seventh year, the land shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, a Sabbath of the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. Can everybody see this? Yes? Summit, Kobe?
No, you're not sharing.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, okay, now we can see it, right?
Exactly.
Right, and in the seventh year, the land shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, right? Here's this phrase, this is the Sabbath of the land, right? You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest or gather the grapes of your untrimmed vines. It shall be a year of complete rest. Shanat Shabbaton, and here again. Here's the Shabbat Haaretz, Vayta Shabbat Haaretz La'achem Le'ochla, but you may eat whatever the land during its Sabbath will produce, you, your male and female slaves, the hired and bound laborers who live with you, and your cattle and the beasts in your field may eat all its yield, right? And then this is every 7 years, and also one count cycles. Every seventh cycle is the Jubilee year, right? The Jubilee year when slaves go free and land is restored to its original owners per the understandings of the allocation of land recorded in the Bible in the book of Joshua. Now, let's go back to the screen here, right? So, as a matter of, say, rabbinic law, right? There's like mitzvot aseh and mitzvot lo taseh, positive commandments and negative. There's a positive commandment of affirmatively to abstain from agricultural work, and negative commandments on the specific things that one is not supposed to do, the same with Shabbat, right? Shabbat is a combination of do's and don'ts. Now, what is forbidden? What is forbidden to sow, reap, prune, and harvest from trees, but one may do things related to the maintenance and upkeep of trees, right? You know, you're allowed to do things to keep your trees from dying, just you're not supposed to be harvesting from them, right? Whatever produce one's fields produces in that year to be left unclaimed and available to all. You can take for yourself what you need, but only what you need. And everything else you're to leave to others. Crucially, this mitzvah, on its biblical terms, is only applicable in the land of Israel, right? It is not applicable outside the land of Israel. It is what is referred to in Talmud as mitzvah hatluya ba'aretz, right? A mitzvah, an affirmative religious obligation that is dependent on the land, right? That is tied to the land. And there's another feature of Shemitah that's a little less pertinent for our discussion here: the remission of debts, Shemitat ksafim, right? And remember, we, of course, are used to societies that are all about debt, right? All of our commercial life, I mean, not just our credit cards, but all of commercial life depends on loans and debts, etc. Biblical law is operating in a different sort of framework. And especially and Shemitat Ksafim is very much aimed, sort of the mandatory, biblically mandated remission of debts is made to ease the situation of the poor. Right, so that the poor not be crushed in debt. That's also not unrelated to the manumission of slaves in the Jubilee year, because of course, in biblical times and elsewhere, I mean, until fairly recently in world history, right, indebtedness led to being sold into slavery. Okay, so these are the basic outlines of the laws of Shemitah. Now, there is some historical context here, right? Let me make this a little bigger.
Either you can make it as presentation mode, and this way it will be full screen.
How do I do that?
On the small button just by the minus.
Yes.
You have you press on it.
Slideshow?
Slideshow, exactly.
Wow, my God. Okay.
And we will still be able to see you.
Terrific. Terrific. Though at times, and to get out of that, I just hit escape, I suppose, right?
Yes.
Now, no. But I want to get. How do I go back to the slide previous?
With the arrows.
With the arrows.
Yeah.
Here we are. Right. Historical context. Okay. Now, generally, Jews did not own land in the land of Israel / Palestine for much of history. The Jewish agricultural settlement in the land of Israel begins in the latter quarter of the 19th century. The first Jewish agricultural settlement is inaugurated in 1878, called Petach Tikva, and it's sort of the nucleus of what today is like the small city of Petach Tikva. Sort of in the curious nature of these things, both my great-great-grandfather and my wife Tamar's great-great-grandfather were among the people who got Petach Tikva going in the 1870s, and of course the two families have been fighting over the historical credit ever since. But that being said, with Jewish agricultural settlement that begins in the land of Israel in the latter part of the 19th century is generally done, as I say here, by people who are moderate traditionalists. Right? The people doing it, sort of like the people who inaugurate Petach Tikva in 1878, are what we would call Orthodox Jews, right? Who think it's a good idea for Jews to become agriculturally productive and build new sorts of institutions and deepen that kind of Jewish agricultural life in the land of Israel. In addition to some vague ideas about like national rebirth and productivization, both socioeconomically as well as culturally. This is a bit more explicit starting in the 1880s when you have people coming from Eastern Europe who are part of the Chovevei Tzion movement, the Lovers of Zion. Also, they tend to be sort of either moderate enlighteners or sort of moderate to traditional folks engaged in enlightenment who think that building up some sort of Jewish agricultural presence in Palestine again is something that'll be helpful for rejuvenating Jewish life and Jewish culture, and perhaps even, eventually one day provide Jews a haven from persecution or something like that. But they tend not to have large political ambitions. Now, in the 1880s, so by the time, if Petach Tikva begins in 1878, so by the time you get to the late 1880s, you actually have several Jewish agricultural settlements in the land of Israel. A number of them are also being sponsored by Baron Rothschild. And the question of what do you do during the Shemitah year comes up. So actually, at this point, I'd like to show you a different slide, a different photo. Here we are. This. Okay, do you see? You can see this this collection of photos of bearded gentlemen. Yes. Kobe?
Yes.
That's okay, great.
Yeah, we can see it, but can you large?
Yeah.
Make it a little. Awesome.
Great. So we see the first Shemitah discussions start happening in the late 1880s. This gentleman, Shmuel Moliver, is one of the founders of religious Zionism, right? He's one of the first people who say that as traditional Jews should be engaged in the project of settlement in the land of Israel, and he comes up with this idea of how to deal with Shemitah. Well, I'll get into the details of it, but there is a halachic solution to be found, what's called heter mechira, the permissive sale of parts of the land of Israel that enables Shemitah, that sort of like removes the land of Israel from the mitzvah of Shemitah. I'll get into the details of that in a moment. And he floats this possibility. Now, not everyone appreciates this. This gentleman is Rabbi Yeshua Leib Diskin, who is a leader of what is called Hayishuv Hayashan, the older Jewish community of Palestine, the very traditionalist Ashkenazi Jewish community of Palestine, centered in Jerusalem. And for reasons I'll get into in a moment, here as elsewhere, he tends to be opposed to these sorts of newfangled interpretations of Jewish law that are meant to smooth the way for some sort of modern Jewish presence in the land of Israel. This gentleman is Naftali Tzvi Yehudah Berlin, known as the Netziv of Volozhin. He was one of the absolutely greatest Jewish scholars of the 19th century, greatest scholars and educators. He's also the teacher and master of Rav Kook, about whom we'll be talking. And interestingly, he is one of the rabbis who is a qualified supporter of these early settlement efforts. Everything I'm talking about here is before Theodor Herzl and before the Zionist movement. So he's somewhat a very traditional-minded scholar and major authority who is supportive of these early settlement efforts, and precisely for that reason thinks that everybody should keep Shemitah, because after all, we are trying to recreate a Jewish presence in the land of Israel, and what better marks a Jewish presence in the land of Israel than observance of the mitzvah of Shemitah? Now, this is the gentleman with the bank book. This is Baron Edmund de Rothschild. Those of you who are familiar with Zichron Yaakov is sort of named for Jacob de Rothschild. And the Baron and his men are people who, early Jewish settlement, especially in the Galilee, founders. And the Baron decides to sort of become the financial patron of these Jewish agricultural settlements, like Zichron Yaakov, like Rosh Pinah, and also he dispatches his men, who are, say, these administrative bureaucrats, to administer these settlements. So as far as he's concerned, he's very interested in Jewish economic productivity and not terribly interested in Jewish culture and tradition. Right. So he sort of as in terms of looking, I don't mean to say here that all this story is just the interventions of great bearded men, but he very much represents, and even himself as a very important figure, Baron Rothschild, somebody who is driving this sort of Jewish agricultural settlement and putting his money behind it, and very much behind the economic imperative of not wasting one's time with all this sabbatical nonsense. And this is Rav Kook, more about whom in a moment. This is what Rav Kook looked like in the years that we are talking about. Meanwhile, let me go back to our, right. With the advent of the Zionist movement in the mid to late 1890s, and my apologies for the typo there, rabbinic opinion is generally divided, right? In general, we know that Zionism was not, the sort of broad consensus. I mean, nowadays people argue about this, but most of us on the Zoom call are old enough to recall a time when Zionism enjoyed a nearly wall-to-wall consensus in the Jewish world, and that didn't happen until World War II, right? Zionism was a highly contested position for much of its history, and especially with the advent of the Zionist movement in the mid to late 1890s, rabbinic opinion generally divided. Most traditional rabbis opposed Zionism, as it did, of course. I mean, Reform Judaism opposed Zionism for its own reasons. But what we call Orthodox rabbis opposed Zionism, and with very, here, I'll just stop the share and get a little more dynamic. The Orthodox rabbis opposed Zionism with very good reason. I mean, they understood that this is a very secular movement that is being led by an entirely unchurched, assimilated Jew, Theodor Herzl. That this movement was secularizing traditional Jewish ideas, right? Say take the revival of modern Hebrew. Hebrew is supposed to be a sacred language. You're supposed to use it for prayer and Torah study and certain kinds of correspondence between intellectuals. You're certainly not supposed to use it to be digging ditches and shopping for groceries, right? Zionism is sort of the idea of the messianic restoration is something that is supposed to usher in a new world, right? It's not supposed to be just some function of the vagaries of statecraft. Crucially, according to Jewish thought, Jewish and rabbinic tradition, who decides when the Jewish exile ends? God decides when the Jewish exile ends, and presumably is a reward for good behavior, right? And so precisely modernity, when Jews are abandoning tradition in droves, is really seemingly an unpropitious time to proclaim redemption, right? And also more deeply ingrained in rabbinic culture, sort of where this notion of this theological issue of exile ends when God says it ends, was also a very pragmatic position for many centuries, because a key to rabbinic political thought for centuries was basically keep your head down. Don't mix it up with the Gentiles. Don't confront them. Don't try to play their games of power politics, because eventually you'll be destroyed. You can't not be destroyed, right? So just sort of so to speak, stay low and keep moving. So everything that seemed to them like healthy, both theologically sound and politically healthy survival instincts that had stood the Jewish people in good stead for many centuries, Zionism seemed to toss that out the window. So most rabbis were opposed. You had Orthodox rabbis who were in favor of the Zionist movement, again, like I said, Shmuel Moliver, that sort of thing. And indeed, they created a faction within the World Zionist movement, a small party called the Mizrahi, which became the forerunner of the Israel's longstanding National Religious Party, which is the forerunner of several of the parties in Israeli politics today, whether it's Naftali Bennett's Yamina or the party that calls itself Tzionut Hadatit and some other sort of little offshoots. So their stance was that they wanted to play ball with Zionism because they thought that, Jewish civic, political, economic disabilities are quite genuine in the late 19th century in both Western and Eastern Europe, and there's the resurgence. There's this new form of modern anti-Semitism, which seems unconnected to traditional Christian anti-Semitism. And so Zionism seems to be a good way of dealing with this, and there is something nice to be said about Jews living in the land of Israel and being economically productive there, et cetera, et cetera. But please don't tell us that this is about some sort of Jewish cultural renaissance. Please don't tell us that this is part of some sort of Jewish spiritual renewal, right? Just keep that out of this. Now, Theodor Herzl welcomes them into the Zionist movement because he understands, secular as he is, Herzl understands that he needs some sort of rabbinic presence and sanction for his movement, and he has to keep tacking between them and between younger cohorts who very much are looking to Zionism as a way of revitalizing not just like Jewish social, economic, and political life, but also Jewish culture, like who really believe in the revival of Hebrew as a literary language, and also who see Zionism as a vehicle to wage a kind of class war even against the Jewish bourgeoisie and how it's oppressing the poor, and who see Zionism as revolution in Jewish consciousness. And then you have Rav Kook. Abraham Isaac Kook, he's born in 1865, he passes away in 1935. He emerges as sort of a party of one man, but very consequential one, as the leading rabbinic figure who actually endorses the Zionist movement, and not for the political and social and economic stuff, because he doesn't much, he cares about that in terms of like, he doesn't want people to be poor and he doesn't want people to be persecuted, but he embraces in his own distinctive way Zionism precisely because he sees that it is the vehicle of a new spiritual, cultural revolution that Judaism needs, right? And Rav Kook comes to this not through political activism, because before he moves to Palestine in 1904, he's entirely uninvolved in early Zionist politics and Kibbutz Zion and all the stuff I talked about before. But he comes to it out of philosophical wrestlings and theological wrestlings with how can Jews figure out the relationship between body and soul? What is the Jewish body supposed to do in relationship to the Jewish soul? How is Jewish morality supposed to interact with the best elements of non-Jewish morality and together shape the course of human history? These are the kinds of things that are preoccupying him. And he sees this Jewish nationalist movement precisely increasingly led by, or with a mounting presence of revolutionary-minded people, among whom were his classmates in the yeshiva of Volozhin, headed by Rabbi Berlin, whose photo I showed you a few moments ago. Because another crucial feature in terms of setting the historical context is that the year that he arrives in Palestine, and he comes in Palestine, he's invited to become the rabbi of Jaffa, Yaffo, and the surrounding agricultural colonies. There is no Tel Aviv at this point. Tel Aviv, the first beginning of the founding of Tel Aviv is 1909, which is to say, when you come to be the rabbi of Yaffo, it means you have come to be the rabbi of the new Yishuv, the new Jewish community of Palestine, right? The people who bring him there, some of them are the veterans of these agricultural efforts, like creating Petach Tikva and so forth, very much see in this brilliant young, somewhat idiosyncratic intellectual, the person who can provide the rabbinic leadership for the new kind of Jewish Palestine that they're hoping to create. And from early on, he places himself in the middle of this, because 1904, the year that he arrives, is also because it's shortly after the Kishinev pogroms and so forth. You start seeing mass migration out of Russia, and that is also the time when you start seeing the arrival of large cohorts of Zionist revolutionaries, right? If you think of people like David Ben-Gurion, most famously, people for whom Zionism is itself a revolution against Jewish history. It's a revolution against Jewish religion. It is explicitly socialist. It's a revolution on, so that the Zionist movement will be sort of like the Land of Israel branch of the world socialist movement. The revival of Hebrew is meant to create a new, modern, secular Hebrew culture, right? That's in a kind of deep dialogue with the tradition, which it is, though, explicitly rejecting. Of course, most rabbis are absolutely horrified by this. I mean, they tend to, when they see their secular Zionists, they tend to prefer them, like Theodor Herzl, who doesn't pretend to know anything about Judaism and doesn't pretend to have very many ideas about Jewish history or culture, although that's a bit of an overstatement. Herzl has some. But also, so many of these revolutionaries are people who themselves grew up in traditional backgrounds. Like I said, a number of them were classmates of Rav Kook in yeshiva, and much of his thought develops out of his reflection on them. And in a sense, his larger argument with his rabbinic peers is, my dear colleagues, these young rebellious socialist revolutionaries, it's true that they're in full-fledged rebellion against us, but they're not doing this because they want to eat cheeseburgers, right? Look what they do with their lives. They care deeply about the Jewish people. They care about ideals of justice. They think we don't care enough about the Jewish people, and they're probably right. They think our religious ideas about theology and so forth are outdated and stale, and they're probably right. They think we don't care enough about ethics, and they're probably right. So he sees all of this, and he's not some sort of sociologist. I mean, it goes without this. We'll see this has deeper roots in his theological reading of the divinely guided process of Jewish history, and this comes to play in how he looks at Shemitah. So he arrives in 1904, and in 1906, the first Shemitah comes around. So here, for instance, let me show you in, here I just want to move this thing, and here, no, I had, was this it? No, somewhere, I thought I'd put up an image. At any rate, well, actually, this is just a photo of Rav Kook in later years, but you get a sense of here's a rabbi amid secular pioneers, right? Which is very much what he was and what he became. Now, in 1910, right, in 1909, with the advent towards the first Shemitah of 1909, 1910, I mean, the first Shemitah since he arrives in the land of Israel, he publishes a small treatise called Shabbat Haaretz. Rav Kook was a very prolific writer, a very fast writer. By all accounts, he wrote this in about 2 weeks. And it's most of it is a commentary on Maimonides' volume on the laws of Shemitah, because I showed you earlier these verses in Deuteronomy. In the Mishnah, there's a tractate devoted to the laws of Shemitah and called Masechet Shvi'it, right? So like the tractate of the seventh. There's no Babylonian Talmud on it, but there is Jerusalem Talmud on it, Yerushalmi, and Maimonides has extensive discussion of it in his monumental code. Now, what Rav Kook does in this volume is he does two things. He lays out extensive halachic discussion, and he also provides a theological introduction, which is a little rare in halachic treatises. But he explains the sort of the historical theological ideas underlying his embrace of this, what was a very innovative halachic strategy to deal with the question of Shemitah, because I should have said this explicitly. The obvious question is, if you have these agricultural settlements and they're struggling to sort of establish themselves, they can't really afford to take a year off, right? So the concern is that this new Jewish agricultural effort in Palestine will fall apart. And so he publishes this book, right? Now, let me move this along. Kobe, can you help me out as to why the slideshow is not working? Here we go. Great.
It worked.
Terrific. Okay. So first, I'll walk through the halachic issues. Right? This isn't just. First of all, this is important. Second, Rav Kook is this extremely expansive, lyrical, mystic, poetic theologian, but at the same time, he's profoundly a jurist. I mean, his identity also as a jurist is very much, so to speak, a spine of his. And part of what's interesting about, one of the things that's so fascinating about him, is that it's rare to find somebody who's this ecstatic mystic who's drawn at times to like totally burst every conceivable boundary you can imagine, and at the same time is very committed to the strictures of Jewish law. And what's interesting are the ways often in which that's less of a contradiction than sort of a complementarity, that it's precisely the fact that he's like very bound in many ways to the idea of law and structure and order that sort of frees him up to engage in very expansive theological and spiritual musings, but that's a subject for a longer conversation. Now, this is just a schematic walking through of the technical, halachic, legal issues that he and other rabbinic decisors deal with. So, the starting point is that there is an halachic policy overall that starts with the Talmud, that in the face of massive economic loss and distress, one ought to strive for leniency. Right? There's a famous passage in the Talmud, Chas HaKadosh Baruch Hu Mamunam Yisrael, the Holy Blessed One takes care with the financial means of the people of Israel, right? Is gentle with them. And so there's throughout the ages, there's a sense that in the face of great financial loss, it's time for rabbis to exercise some ingenuity. Okay, there's a threshold question. Is Shemitah obligatory today? Right? And that in turn, in terms of the language, the same way in America, we would ask, is the law applicable? And is the law applicable in the federal level or in the state level or the city level, etc.? Right? Is something, or in the criminal law, is something a felony or something is a misdemeanor? Rabbinic law, too, has its own internal categories for classifying laws and their degrees of force and applicability. Is the obligation of Shemitah today primary, which is to say Torah deoraita, or secondary rabbinic drabanan? Right, as I'm sure many of you know, within halacha in general, there's two broad, mitzvot are seen as either deoraita or drabanan, things that either derive directly from God's revelation of Mount Sinai or are derivatory of rabbinic enactment or rabbinic interpretation. And they are of different status, right? Obviously, something that comes directly from the mouth of God is binding in ways, and there's much less room for leeway in interpretation there than there is in second-order rabbinic prohibition. So the threshold question is Shemitah a primary or a secondary commandment today? And so, according to a number of medieval authorities, right, and sort of this is a very tradition-based system. So, according to like major medieval authorities, the latter. It is a secondary rabbinic obligation. Why? Because most of the Jewish people do not reside in the land of Israel, right? Sort of the way the rabbis understood is that the law of Shemitah applies only when the overwhelming majority of the Jewish people are living in the land of Israel, and because there is some doubt as to the precise dating of the Shemitah years, right? Given the many vicissitudes of Jewish history, we're pretty sure this year is a Shemitah year, but of course you can't be 100% sure. Okay. Even if, and so because the idea behind the head, so if the land of Israel, if the question is like what, and here, let me just stop share for a second. The basic vehicle of this permissive rabbinic ruling on Shemitah, right? If the law of Shemitah only applies to land that is owned by a Jew, can you sell the land to a non-Jew? In which case, it no longer in which case, because remember, like the commandment, this is a mitzvah hatluya ba'aretz. It is a commandment incumbent on the land, right? If a Jew does not own the land in the land of Israel, then the land presumably is exempt. That's the fundamental logic behind this. Now, right? Excuse me. Let me. Well, here I'm just right. Does non-Jewish ownership in the land of Israel remove that parcel from Shemitah? Frankly, it's unclear. But because Shemitah today is d'Rabbanan, right? This is how this principle, this argument follows from the previous argument. If this is of a primary, if this were of a primary Torah level obligation, then you couldn't sell the land. You couldn't try to do a permissive sale. But because it's secondary, then there's room for leniency here. Now, there is a prohibition in the Torah on selling land of Israel to non-Jews. It's in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 7, verse 2, right? It says, lo tchanem, right? One is affirmatively forbidden from selling the land of Israel to a non-Jew. So what about that prohibition? Now, that doesn't necessarily apply here. Rav Kook and others say, why? Because this is a sale. The sale is short-term, right? This isn't a long-term sale. This is a sale for just 1 year. Second, the very point of the prohibition of Shemitah, the very point of the prohibition on the selling parts of the land of Israel to non-Jews is to strengthen the Jewish presence in the land. And here the point of selling it for a year is to strengthen the Jewish presence in the land. And second, and another issue is that, it's just not any old non-Jew. You're not allowed to sell the land of Israel to idolaters. Well, according to Jewish law, Muslims are not considered idolaters, right? Islam is not considered, by and large in Jewish law, Islam is not considered a form of idolatry, for all the obvious reasons. So this prohibition on selling to Muslims would be less severe. Now, crucially, Rav Kook says, those who choose not to abide by this permissive ruling must be allowed to do so, and the ruling must be revisited time and again, every 7 years. I'll get back to that in a second. Finally, why was this approach not used in the past? Because Jewish land ownership was too minimal for the question ever to arise. But this issue, crucially, those who choose not to abide by this permissive ruling must be allowed to do so. Remember I showed you that picture of Baron Rothschild? This is where it gets difficult. Because Rav Kook issued this permissive ruling, and then when people working on this land that was supervised by the Baron and his men didn't want to abide by it and said, we want not to work on the sabbatical year, the Baron and his men would say, hey, what's with you people? Get back to work. The rabbi said it's fine. And throughout all his years in Palestine, first in Yaffo and then eventually as chief rabbi of the land of Israel as a whole, Rav Kook was regularly arguing with these kinds of entities, the Baron and similarly situated entities, saying, I told you, people who don't want to abide by this should not be made to. This is only for people who want to avail themselves of this. Right? So this also, it's another layer of complexity here, where the rabbi issues a permissive ruling and then these quite literally baronial authority runs with it much more than he intended. Now, the last thing I want to talk about here before we go to questions is what's crucially the theological underpinning of this, because he also adds that in his volume. Now, how does Rav Kook describe what Shemitah is? Excuse me. And again, it is usually not done, even methodologically, this is an innovation, because usually the same way American legal treatises, when I was in law school and we studied like the restatement on the law of contracts of the American Law Institute, it doesn't come with a philosophical treatise on what is a contract, right? And the same is true in Jewish law. So Rav Kook doing this is a bit of a departure from the genre. At any rate, what is the point of Shemitah, he says? Shemitah, like the weekly Sabbath, like the weekly Shabbat, is meant to create an ideal world free of hierarchy and exploitation, right? What Shabbat does for the individual, he writes, Shemitah does for the nation as a whole. The Jewish people, in whom the godly creative force is planted eternally and distinctively, has a special need to periodically reveal the divine light within itself with full intensity and crucially. And Rav Kook comes out often on the seemingly liberal side of things, but he's not what you would call a liberal, or his sources are not the sources of liberal thought. This is not a functional idea. He doesn't think that it's really good for people to have rest now and again. This arises from the profound connection between the land of people and the people of Israel as facets of God's manifestation on earth. Let me go over that again. The land of Israel and the people of Israel are facets of God's manifestation on earth. This is a point that's crucial in Rav Kook's thought that comes out of his indebtedness to the Kabbalah. To make a very long story short, right? Within the Kabbalah, a chief Kabbalistic doctrine is that there is something called the Sfirot, which are sort of like the deep inner structure, a divinely a manifestation or emanation of God from the eternal unknowable God that is the deep structure of this world. And in this deep structure, these nodal points of divinity that construct our world, a number of them, or there are certain things that constitute the manifestation of God's physical presence in this world. And one of them is the Jewish people, and one of them is the land of Israel, and one of them is actually the oral Torah, right? The eternal, divinely given and revealed Torah as understood and interpreted and lived by human beings. Rav Kook takes these ideas very, very seriously. So for him, the land of Israel is not just a parcel of land, right? It is itself a spiritual entity with a throbbing life of its own, as are the Jewish people, as is the Torah that the Jewish people create. Now, it's somewhat shocking to our ears, and with good reason. It's profoundly essentializing. It's all kinds of things. But as far as he's concerned, this enables him to say that that which is good, that in a deep sense, the well-being of the Jewish people and what the Torah wants and what's good for the land of Israel are ultimately supposed to be in harmony with one another and not at cross purposes with one another. And that's part of the backdrop to his permissive ruling here. Now, right? The distinctive character of the people in the land dovetail with each other, the soul of the people in the land intertwine, etc., right? The people works with its soul force on the land, and the divine seed is revealed through its spiritual influence. The land too works on the people, refining their character and land with the divine desire for life inherent in their makeup, right? So the idea that living, the point of like the Jewish, one feature or one point of the Jewish connection to the land of Israel is that living in the land of Israel and being connected to it forces the Jews to relate to land in a certain way. It forces Jews to relate to society in a certain way, right? It is no accident that the Holy Land is also the land in which you have a sabbatical every 7 years, in which in which slaves are supposed to go free, right? And which is the center also of like the release of debts and so forth. Now, crucially, there is a larger historical process at work here. People even know about, when, again, getting back to what I said earlier for Rav Kook, sort of the quick version of this is, of course, that the Zionist movement is the unwitting secular instrument of God's redemption. But it's not that God is hoodwinking these people into doing the bidding of the Orthodox people. No. As I said, a crucial theological and philosophical preoccupation of Rav Kook from his early years is what's the relationship between the body and the soul. And basically, he develops a theory of Jewish history. And he's of a piece here with other Zionist thinkers. By the way, he's not the only person who comes to Zionism less for the politics and more for the philosophy, right? And I don't mean just religious Zionists either. For him, right, in the Judaism of the Bible, the Bible is a very embodied book. It's an embodied religion, right? The Hebrew Bible is full of sex and food and love and war and passion and desire and longing and earthiness and all of that. And diasporic Judaism, exilic Judaism, is more individual. It's less collective. It's more individual. It's more spiritualized. It's more ethicized, right? As he says in exile, Israel stopped trying to amass power, chariots, and horses like every other people on earth, and the nation as a collective ceased all materialistic pursuits. Right, and now is the time to synthesize the spiritual and material worlds as the deeper meaning of the slowly unfolding messianic process, right? Because he really believes that he is living in a messianic age. The wide-scale Jewish return to the land and agriculture is itself a visible sign of the dawning messianic age, right? The spirit of the living hidden God concealed throughout the exile is being revealed. It can fully appear only in a people living a holistic life on its own land. Just as with individuals, the divine presence rests only on one who is strong, sufficient, self-sufficient, and dignified, as well as possessing spiritual qualities of wisdom and humility. By the way, this is not conventional religious language to describe the point of mitzvot. You see the ways in which he's influenced by modern thought and using it to sort of think about the deeper meaning of Shemitah. So to the divine presence rests only on the people collectively when they are strong, materially self-sufficient, and upright. Here it means also like morally upright. And what about the fact that all the people who are doing this, so many of the people who are doing this work are themselves like secular revolutionaries? Well, this is an argument that has no small amount of that can cut several ways, but he says, and this is something that he says in polemics, he's roundly attacked for these positions by his rabbinic peers, right? Because of the sort of the halachic creativity here, and also because he's sort of becoming the patron, sort of like a rabbinic patron of these militant secular revolutionaries. So he argues that the secular pioneers are providing the material basis for total redemption, and redemption is about the integration of body and soul, right? They are redeeming the Jewish body, and together we will all redeem the Jewish soul. And crucially, showing halachic responsiveness on a more practical matter, showing halachic responsiveness to their circumstances will lessen their resistance to religion. He tells his rabbinic colleagues over and over, if we keep saying no to these people on everything, well, of course they're going to think we're not interested in them and their progress, right? We have to show them that we're taking into account responsive changing conditions and responding to them, and sort of do it out of some kind of dialogue with them in their larger efforts. And also, the message of social justice, so central to the secular revolutionaries and central to Shemitah, and they're sensitizing us to it as part of God's redemptive plan, right? Rav Kook doesn't just think that the secular pioneers are there to be like the messenger boys or girls of the messianic redemption, but that they have an educative function to the rest of traditional Jewry. That they're sort of summoning traditional Jewry to the better angels of its own nature, right? They are bringing to the fore certain kinds of ethical and collective social justice values that traditional Judaism has let slide. So this is Rav Kook's intervention in Heter Mechira. It becomes a central position. And of course, this becomes the basis for continued agricultural life and work in Shemitah in the state of Israel down to the present day. Now, of course, there's some people who still don't accept it. This becomes, every few years, it becomes a regular point of contention with ultra-Orthodox Jewry who formally argue that they don't accept the institutions of the state, or certainly not of Rav Kook, but of course it's much, much more complicated than that. The interesting thing is that here it's hard to think that Rav Kook imagined that more than a century after his writing this treatise, we would still be using this heter, right? Because he clearly means it as a temporary measure and clearly hopes that people will be availing themselves of this. So looking at this, and this is the last thing I'll say for now, looking at this from the perspective of today, it's just really interesting. Here's this halachist theologian who's doing his best to grapple with these changing historical circumstances, trying to be legally responsive, trying to integrate this into this sort of broader theory, not just of halachic change, but of historical change. And also he does it in emphasizing, and of a piece with his saying that people should not be penalized for wanting to keep Shemitah. He says, even if we don't keep Shemitah, we have to talk about it a lot, and we have to teach it a lot, and we have to explain about it a lot, precisely for the message it holds. The same way that Shabbat once a week conveys to us that the world can actually be different, that we can be better than we are. So too, Shemitah is meant to do that on a larger collective level, and it's really important for him not to just say, well, I'm signing off on a permissive ruling and now go do what you want. Neither to say, well, there's no way we can change this because if I can't live with the ideal Shemitah, then I don't want this at all. He's trying, and this is what's so interesting, riveting by Rav Kook, he's trying both to honor the need to maintain a principled commitment to tradition while also honoring change, and trying very, very hard to see the idealistic motives of the people around him as the working out of questions that are fundamental not just to Judaism but also to the human condition. So that's what I have to say for now, and I'm happy to have. There is just one thing I would like to put in. There's one thing I would like to put in the chat, and that is a link to it's this book, Chazon, right, the Jewish Lab for Sustainability, published. My friend Yehudah Sinclair, who himself is a wonderful scholar and also somebody who works in the field of renewable energy, and so on, published a small book.
He's going to be speaking here in a
great. So let me just put his book in the chat, because he just did a wonderful. I'm just sending this to everyone. Right. It's a brief volume where he translates Rav Kook's introduction to Shabbat Haaretz, and his own introduction is just a small masterpiece of an introduction to Rav Kook in general and Shemitah in general, and it's just a beautiful gem of a book, and I can't recommend.
Kobe, do you know when the date is?
Highly enough. What?
Kobe knows when's the date?
And actually, Rabbi Yehudah Sinclair is our next guest speaker.
Excellent.
In Torah of Israel in January 16th, Sunday of January 16th. Yes. He's so thank you for the great presentation, Yehudah, and also for the great presentation of our next speaker.
Of course, my pleasure. So I think there were some
Um,
questions in the chat. Were there
yes,
not?
there were, and I think we have the time. So, Mark, if you would like, you were the first one to ask, Mr. Clarman, if you want to ask it yourself, or if not, we're going to read it.
You can read it. It's okay. It's the
Yeah.
same question.
Okay. So, can you explain the
Right.
permissibility of eating preserved produce? You're reading it also, Yehudah? So...
Yeah, no, I'm reading it. Okay, the question was, can you explain the permissibility of eating preserved produce versus fresh produce during the Shemitah year? I think I read somewhere in Talmud there's a restriction about eating preserved produce once the season ends. The honest truth is that I would prefer to look that up and give you a proper answer rather than what comes off the top of my head. I mean, my own go-to book on the laws of Shemitah is this volume by Rabbi Michal Tikachinsky, Sefer HaShemitah, and I'll be glad to look that up and get back to you or look up elsewhere. Also, Rabbi Eliezer Melamed online in his Pnei Halacha series. I mean, I think those parts of Pnei Halacha have not been translated into English to the best of my knowledge. But for those of you who read Hebrew, he does a beautiful job, and there's other English language resources on Shemitah, but again, I would rather not just answer off the cuff on that one, and probably mislead you in one fashion or other, if that's okay. But please feel free to write me on that.
And Nancy Kaplan?
You can read my question, it's okay.
Okay. During the years when Rav Kook was stranded outside the land, as a result of World War I, did he maintain his leadership role and influence vis-a-vis the Yeshuv, write books, issue rulings, etc.?
Right. So, okay, thank you. I'm really delighted that you asked that, because as it turns out, in this book of mine that Rabbi Madeline was kind enough to mention, I devoted an entire chapter to Rav Kook in World War I. And I did that because, in terms of Rav Kook's own story, I just felt and feel very powerfully that World War I was in many ways central to this. As you allude to, Rav Kook in July 1914, right? He traveled to Europe. He left Eretz Yisrael for the first time in a decade. And he traveled to Europe for two reasons. One was to seek some medical treatment for himself and for his wife, the Rabbanit, Rivka, and also to address a conference of Agudat Yisrael, the ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionist political party or political grouping, which still exists. And he was hoping to talk to them explain to them his perspectives on why he thought they should also perhaps change their views about the Zionist movement, etc. Now, he found himself stranded in the war, and he was nearly interned because technically he was a Russian national, and right, because the Ottomans didn't really hand out a whole lot of citizenship to East European immigrants to the land of Israel. And he managed to escape internment. He spent about 1.5 years in Switzerland, and then was in London, where he was the rabbi of the Eastern European Jewish community there. So, generally speaking, the story of the land of Israel in World War I and Jewish communities in World War I is a fascinating and insufficiently understood story, insufficiently told story. I often think it's because the Holocaust is so overwhelmingly large that it obscures just how horrible. I mean, World War I is, of course, obviously horrible for Western civilization, world civilization, but it was also horrible for the Jews. Many Jewish communities, as Americans, we tend to focus always on the Western front of these wars, but in the Eastern front, the Jews were right in the path of war between the Tsar's armies and the Austro-Hungarian armies. And in the land of Israel, the Ottomans took a very tough line. I mean, there were people died of starvation in the land of Israel. My grandmother stayed alive during World War I. She and my great uncle got jobs sweeping the floors in a Turkish officers club on Rehov Agrippas in Yerushalayim. And that's how they were orphans, but that's how they were able to get some bread with which to feed their siblings, because my uncle told me stories about coming into houses and finding people who were dead of starvation. Massive conscriptions. The Ottomans kicked all the Jews out of Tel Aviv. The Jews didn't know which side of the war to go on. Actually, when news of the Armenian genocide happened is when the Jews decided to take sides with the British. It was a mess. It was a disaster. So communications were not great. Rav Kook could not exercise a leadership capacity in Jaffa, although of course he was still a major figure. He was writing, he was issuing halachic rulings, and he had some extremely consequential thoughts about politics and the nature of the war, and sort of theological meditations on the war. And it's where he wrote some very consequential things about to the extent to which he developed an approach to politics and statecraft, and was also crucially during World War I that he decided that Jewish politics would have to be different, right? That it couldn't be as violent and obsessed with violence as non-Jewish politics. And interestingly, so he wasn't very present in Palestine during those years, and yet after World War I, he was the obvious choice to come back and to be the chief. At the time, the chief rabbinate, the Ashkenazi chief rabbinate, did not yet exist. Under the Ottomans, there had been a Sephardi chief rabbi, but the Ashkenazi chief rabbinate didn't exist. But he was the obvious candidate to become the new chief rabbi of Jerusalem, because he was the only person who sort of could square all the circles. He was the only major rabbinic figure who, because of his halachic stature, still had credibility, had a great deal of credibility with the avowedly traditionalist and even anti-Zionist elements, who was sympathetic to the Zionist movement, who got along well with moderate traditionalists, and also, as we see in this treatise on Shemitah, he'd already developed a whole philosophy of history to deal with this thing, right? He wasn't simply, somebody who would who was politically maneuvering well in these things, because actually he was terrible at political maneuver, but he actually had developed a full-blown ideology that could validate religious engagement with the Zionist movement, which became really important because after World War I in Palestine, the Zionists were clearly in charge, thanks to the Balfour Declaration. What's more, the Balfour Declaration also validated Rav Kook's messianic reading of the times. During World War I, he writes a whole lot of stuff about it. This is terrible. The rivers of blood, civilization is destroying itself. The world is coming to an end. And then, boom, with the Balfour Declaration, he's sort of, so to speak, saved by the bell, right? This really was, it's every now and then he wonders, is this like the great war that the sacred scriptures and Kabbalah say will precede the messianic redemption? And then Balfour comes along and he says, wow, I guess it was. Right? Balfour seems an external, and it's not the first time, this is a subject for a long conversation, it's not the first time that external events, to his mind, validate his messianic reading of the times. By the way, and he's not alone, right? Even some of his most hard-bitten rabbinic opponents who thought that Zionism was this terrible, horrible, awful thing were very moved by Balfour Declaration to say, well, maybe this is some sort of messianic sign from above. So all those things taken together are part of how World War I was very important to him. But also, so that's by way of, I have a lot more to say about Rav Kook and World War I. That's by way of answering your question. So he wasn't hands-on. There was very little he could do. Communications were terrible. Institutions were falling apart. But he very much maintained and in some ways deepened his stature over the course of World War I.
Yehudah, I have a question. Kobe, there are more questions in the chat.
No, not at the moment.
I have a question regarding the legacy of Rav Kook today. So he came up with Eter Mechira, but it was within the context of, as you said, a theological, philosophical construct. And what remains of that today? What's Shemitah today in Israel? Beyond, whether you're for or
right. No, that's an excellent question. The sad truth is not much. Right? It's sort of, the great analogy here, so this is on a much greater scale, is sort of like the notion of selling chametz on Pesach. Right? We know in the history of halacha, the idea of widespread sale, selling your chametz to a non-Jew on Pesach, that really caught on only, as I understand it, in 15th, 16th centuries, when Jews in northeastern Europe were sort of limited in their professions and regularly had to be innkeepers and had to keep on hand large stocks of chametz whiskey. And that was just sort of become this thing. And in many respects, that's happened to Shemitah. And so that's why thus far the efforts are, so yeah, in the Tzioni Dati world, right, there are every 7 years there's a new spate of books about Shemitah, and people try to figure out what they can do and what they can't do, and people try to figure out ways to, for instance, like, Shemitah was coming up, so I took out my copy of Rav Tikachinsky and just sort of read up, what do I still have to do, what do I do about, like, my daughters are growing vegetables and are mirpeset, so what am I supposed to do with those? So people will do that sort of thing. Obviously, Haredim will sort of, who don't. There are ways, not infrequently, say you have, say, Haredim who will deliberately buy only from like Arab-owned produce that is always owned by Arabs and not part of Eter Mechira. The larger challenge, of course, and it's part of a larger challenge and something that you're trying to do in this wonderful series, and it's what Rav Kook tries to do in the beginning of his introduction of Shabbat Haaretz, is say, this isn't just a bunch of do's and don'ts. There's a vision here about what society is supposed to look like. The same way the ideals of Shabbat are supposed to infuse Sheshet Yemei HaMaaseh, the other 6 days of the week, the ideals of Shemitah are supposed to infuse us the rest of the time. So obviously Shmitat Ksafim, like, Micha Odenheimer, who I hope will be talking in this, right, has these wonderful ideas about using ideas of Shemitah to talk about, erasing third world debt, right, and this idea of indebtedness. And these questions also of the relationship to the land. And as climate, as the earth is telling us more and more, you're killing us. You're killing me, right? The idea of Shemitah becomes this very powerful idea, right? And as always, though, the question is, so in the time for the Chumash, in the time of Chazal, Shemitah was not, you were not supposed to sit and have study circles about Shemitah, you're supposed to actually do something. And that's the challenge today. What are the things that we can tachlis do, and we better start doing? And I mean, there are, of course, every few years in Israel, there's people who try to get these discussions going and galvanize them a bit. But, it's really, lahavdil, this is like the ridiculous version of it. But a colleague of mine and I are putting together at the World Congress of Jewish Studies this summer in Jerusalem, a series of academic discussions of like, what does Jewish thought have to contribute to discussions of climate change? Maybe we don't, we should just keep our mouths shut and like figure out how we can be helpful here. But the larger meaning of Shemitah, it's hard off. There again, within pockets of the society, there's people who try to keep it together. But as I don't need to tell you, in today's commercialized society and where everything is commodified, it's really hard, and especially as always, one doesn't want to fall in the trap of sort of fetishizing halakha. Well, I did a real good heter mechira, so I'm okay.
So we have a new question in the chat box.
Who are today's heirs to Rav Kook? Yes. My dear friend Barry Liftenberg, to whom I know I owe an email, and I'm very sorry about that. I apologize. Who are today's heirs to Rav Kook? But everyone and no one, right? Who are the heirs to Maimonides? Obviously, Rav Kook's legacy is very complicated. Rav Kook has many, many disciples and many, many Latter-day disciples, the question of Rav Kook's legacy is like a large and complex and contested question. Obviously, many people in religious Zionist world see themselves as his heirs, and of course, there's large questions: who are the true heirs of Rav Kook? The people on the right, the people on the left, people in the middle, even the people on the right. There's fantastic arguments. Just take one example, in the recent arguments over whether or not to join Naftali Bennett's coalition, there was a split between the Latter-day Cookians. What's worse? Making a coalition with in terms of Rav Kook's vision of a renewed Jewish culture in the land of Israel under the renewed, as part of the Jewish national revival, what is a bigger sin? Joining a coalition with a Muslim Arab, or joining a coalition with left-wing Tel Avivis? right? Who's worse, Mansour Abbas or Mirav Michaeli? And there was a very genuine and consequential split within religious Zionism over that question. So it's divided there. And also I'm one of these people who thinks Rav Kook is a large and capacious thinker who can't be captured by any ideological or party category. In this respect, he's like Maimonides. And also, when the one last thing is, as many of you know, Rav Kook, if you'll call it more right-wing interpretation of Rav Kook is of course deeply associated with his son Rav Yehudah Kook. He was a very important figure in his own right, and what I always say is I don't claim to understand Rav Kook better than his father, better than his son did. I just interpret him given who I am, and I'm Yehudah Mirsky, living in my time and place, and I have to take moral responsibility for my interpretive choices. Ms. Sandy Coy asked, what would Rav Kook say about Shemitah in Chutz La'aretz? Okay, again, I try not to put words in his mouth. I think he would probably say Shemitah is relating to the land of Israel, has nothing to do with Chutz La'aretz because it's the diaspora, it's not the land of Israel. Shemitah is only applicable in the land of Israel, full stop. And as far as the remission of debts, again, there's like well-established rabbinic principle that in principle, the remission of debts, debt forgiveness in the Shemitah does apply outside the land of Israel. It's not a time-bound precept. There's good rabbinic jurisprudence for several centuries now that inasmuch as Shemitah is generally not being observed in the land of Israel, so too the remission of debts need not be observed outside the land of Israel. However, again, not to put words in his mouth, I think Rav Kook would think, that's a wonderful question. And yeah, we really ought to think about ways in which, to the extent to which, because also he very much wants to keep Shemitah alive, right? He wants to keep Shemitah alive. And so if we can think about debt forgiveness in Chutz La'aretz, that would be something to think about. And I think Shuli Paso has a question, yes?
No, it's me. I'm sorry. I'm using both the computer so I can read the chat.
Oh, okay, fine. Because Shuli's an old dear friend.
I'm monitoring the conversation through.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
So what's the question?
And if anybody else has a question, then I will give them, to ask it because it's actually going to be the last one. So if anybody else has a question, or it's okay if I'll ask, I guess I'll go. You were talking about Rav Kook, and I want to ask you actually about the Yeshuv's reaction to Rav Kook's, findings, because eventually they were all secular. So right. How did they? So
it's really very, very interesting to see how there were some people who just thought that Rav Kook was this like crazy lunatic mystic, etc. Right? They tried to get him involved in the lobbying for the because he's living in London. Chaim Weizmann sends his right-hand man Nachum Sokolov to talk to Rav Kook and see if he can get him involved in the lobbying around the Balfour Declaration. And they sit and talk, and Sokolov writes back to him, all we could do was talk about the Zohar and Spinoza. Like there really wasn't a whole lot of, I couldn't strategize with him about how to lobby in the parliament. As far as the secular revolutionaries whom he's most trying to influence or with whom he's in deepest dialogue, it's mixed. There are some of them who actually are profoundly appreciative of him, right? Beryl Katznelson, right? Sort of like the saint, so to speak, of labor Zionism. Okay. At one point says there's two great Jews who live among us in the land of Israel today, Rav Kook and Yosef Chaim Brenner, right? Sort of these two spiritual giants, one the great rabbi, the other the great writer. Now, Yosef Chaim Brenner himself, who's this fascinating figure, who's sort of like the tortured secular saint of modern Hebrew literature, is extremely ambivalent about Rav Kook. He's engaging in these dialogues with Rav Kook. They don't meet a whole lot, but they're sort of like writing about one another. Rav Kook publishes articles about, the deep spiritual meaning of the Zionist revolution and all of that. And Yosef Chaim Brenner keeps saying, Rabbi, I see that you're trying to draw me into your like magic circle of holy revolution, but I'm not. Believe me, I actually am in rebellion against you. I don't want to be part of your sacred revolution. And what's more, I think you're probably more of a revolutionary than you're letting on to, because you actually do write about me and my people with some sensitivity. And what's interesting is then Rav Kook tells one of his associates, he's talking about Brenner, and he says, Brenner says, I'm torn. Of course I'm torn. Who isn't torn? Any serious person is torn. All of our life is about trying to reconcile irreconcilable things, to find the unity that always evades us. And that's why in the Kabbalah we talk about unification. Now, as time goes by, in the mandate years, when Rav Kook is already chief rabbi of all of Palestine, the years of the second Aliyah, which so fascinate me, because those, in retrospect, are sort of like the heroic period of Zionist ideology. And then after Balfour, people have to start building institutions and making alliances and building political parties. And that's where Rav Kook has a harder time with these folks, because he keeps trying not to play the political game. Even though he's now in a position where that's what he's supposed to be doing. And also he develops this, something we didn't talk about much, he develops this extremely ecumenical approach to things where like everybody has their own piece of the truth. The Orthodox people have a piece of the truth, the nationalists have a piece of the truth, the liberals have a piece of the truth. It's like, it's an extremely compelling view, but it's very hard to be a meaningful political actor in those ways. And so finally, in terms of how Rav Kook is viewed by the new Yeshuv, he's a very inspiring figure, and I think a very tragic figure in many ways. Tragic but inspiring.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Our time is up, unfortunately. I mean, I in person, I have a lot more questions, and I'm sure that our audience,
we will take up over time.
Yeah. But I really want to thank you, Professor Mirsky, for joining us today and for educating us. And I want to thank everybody who joined us today. We are looking forward to seeing you in our future events. As Professor Mirsky mentioned, Rabbi Yedidia Sinclair is going to be our next guest in Torah of Israel, and that would be on Sunday of January 16th, same time. Stay tuned to our newsletter so you can register. And for now, toda v'litraot.